The first bell of the morning rang loud and sharp against the cool air of 2004, reverberating off the worn red bricks of the school building. Students poured through the iron gates, their chatter blending into a single noisy hum as they scattered across the courtyard. Backpacks bounced against shoulders, sneakers scuffed across the pavement, and the faint smell of cafeteria pancakes drifted from an open window. For most kids, it was just another school day. But for three inseparable best friends, this morning would mark the beginning of a story that no one in town would ever forget. They were always seen together, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense without one another. Teachers knew them for their laughter in the back rows, their whispered secrets exchanged during class, their mischievous grins that betrayed half-formed plans. Other students envied their closeness, that invisible bond that kept them side by side through every moment of the day. On that morning, they were huddled in a corner of the courtyard, speaking quietly, their heads leaning close, their expressions serious in a way that seemed out of place for kids their age. The first period bell rang again, a reminder to hurry inside, but they didn't move. Instead, the three exchanged quick glances, as if confirming an unspoken decision. Slowly, deliberately, they walked toward the side of the schoolyard, slipping past the cluster of students crowding the stairwell. Their backpacks, stuffed with books and half-finished homework, remained abandoned near the bench where they usually sat. A teacher passing by noticed the bags but assumed the children were just running late. Minutes stretched into hours. Teachers marked their names absent. Friends began asking where they were. Parents called the office when their kids never came home for lunch. By the time the last bell of the day echoed through the empty hallways, panic had already started to spread. A janitor collecting trash outside noticed the three backpacks still sitting untouched on the bench, their straps damp from morning dew, their zippers half open as if left behind in a hurry. He brought them inside to the principal's office, and that was when the alarms truly went off. Phones rang in every household connected to those children. Mothers rushed to the school, their voices breaking as they demanded answers. Fathers scoured the neighborhood, calling out names into the dusky evening. The police arrived before nightfall, their flashing lights reflecting off the windows, startling the students who had stayed behind for after-school practice. Soon, the courtyard was swarming with officers, teachers, and crying parents. And yet, there was nothing. The classrooms held no clues. The playground, empty now and strangely silent, offered no answers. No one had seen them leave, no one noticed them vanish, and by the time darkness fell, it was as if the three friends had been swallowed by the school itself. That night, while parents sat in their living rooms staring at phones that refused to ring, while police searched with flashlights cutting through the trees behind the school, the backpacks sat on the principal's desk like three silent witnesses. Inside, nothing seemed unusual: textbooks, a crumpled permission slip, a few pencils, a folded note with a smiley face drawn in the corner. But their owners were gone, leaving behind only questions that no one could answer. And the first whispers began to spread. Maybe they hadn't just run away. Maybe something darker had happened. The courtyard that once rang with laughter now stood eerily quiet under the pale glow of streetlights. Police cars lined the curb, radios crackling with clipped voices as officers spread across the school grounds. Dogs barked, their handlers tugging them toward the wooded edges behind the football field. Teachers, still in their professional clothes from the day, huddled near the steps of the building, their faces pale and strained. No one could understand how three children could simply vanish in the middle of a busy school day without a trace. Detectives began their work inside. They searched the lockers row by row, the metallic clang echoing in the deserted hallways. The missing children's lockers were opened first, half-finished assignments, gum wrappers, and photos of friends taped to the insides. Nothing unusual, nothing to explain why their owners had disappeared. In the lost and found room, a pair of sneakers was checked against the missing kids' sizes, only to be ruled out. Every classroom was swept, even the janitor's closet, as if hoping the kids might be hiding in some forgotten corner. The pond behind the school was the next target. Officers waded into the dark water with nets, their beams of light cutting through the mist rising off the surface. Crowds of parents and neighbors gathered behind the yellow tape, whispering prayers, their breath visible in the night air. One mother screamed when an officer held up a piece of cloth from the water, but relief came when it was identified as an old rag, not clothing. Still, the search grew more frantic as the night deepened. By midnight, the woods surrounding the school were alive with flashlights and shouts. Officers marked trees with strips of tape, searching every hollow, every patch of undergrowth. The canine dogs barked and pulled, then whined when their noses hit dead ends. There were no footprints, no broken branches, no discarded belongings that might suggest the children had passed through. It was as though the earth had simply swallowed them whole. The police questioned every student still awake at home, dragging exhausted children from their beds. Did you see them leave? Did you notice anything strange? Did they talk about running away? But the answers were the same. The three best friends had been laughing that morning, whispering about something, but nothing that hinted at danger. They were happy. They had plans. They were just kids. Days turned into weeks. Flyers with their faces, smiling in school portraits, covered telephone poles and shop windows. The local news broadcast updates every night, interviews with tearful parents and stern-faced police chiefs. But the updates quickly turned repetitive. No new leads, no suspects, no evidence. Volunteers combed the woods, drained parts of the pond, and searched abandoned sheds, but nothing ever surfaced. By the end of the year, the story began to fade from headlines, replaced by fresher tragedies. The families, however, never moved on. They gathered every anniversary at the school, holding candles, praying for answers. Teachers left the missing children's desks untouched for months, until finally the school decided to pack away their books and remove the chairs, unable to face the reminders of three lives abruptly cut from the tapestry of everyday life. Still, rumors persisted. Some students swore they had seen strange men near the playground that morning. Others whispered about a door in the basement that no one was allowed to open, a relic from when the school was built decades ago. Police dismissed the stories as childish imagination, but the parents weren't so sure. 8 years later, when the fire raged through the field behind the school, burning away everything that had hidden there, the questions that had haunted the town for nearly a decade would resurface with terrifying force. But in 2004, standing in the empty classrooms with the faint smell of chalk dust still lingering in the air, the only truth anyone could grasp was the unbearable silence where three children's voices should have been. Years passed, but the disappearance never truly left the town. The school carried on, new students enrolled, new teachers replaced the old, but a shadow lingered over every hallway. For those who had been there in 2004, the memories were too sharp, too raw. The bench where the three backpacks were found was eventually removed, but everyone knew exactly where it once sat, as though the absence itself marked the spot more loudly than any plaque ever could. Children whispered stories about the missing friends in hushed tones when teachers weren't listening. Some said they had seen shapes in the windows late at night, even though the classrooms were supposed to be empty. Others swore they had heard laughter echoing in the gymnasium long after the doors were locked. It was always the same. Three distinct voices, faint, distant, carried on the stillness of the night air. By 2007, the school had tried to bury the incident beneath layers of routine and normalcy. Memorials faded, posters were taken down, and lessons carried on as though the missing had never been there. But their presence clung to the place like dust that refused to be wiped away. Teachers quietly avoided mentioning their names, yet sometimes in attendance lists, the names would slip out by mistake, followed by an awkward silence. Students who never even knew the vanished trio claimed to feel their absence, a strange awareness in the back of their minds as they walked down certain corridors. Behind the school, the field grew untamed, a stretch of tall grass, weeds, and wildflowers reclaiming the soil where the search teams had once stomped with flashlights and sticks. Kids dared each other to run through the overgrown lot, but most refused. The field earned a reputation, a cursed place where voices whispered if you stood still too long. Stories spread of footsteps following students at night or a hand brushing against their shoulder when no one was there. Some laughed off the tales as childish fantasy. Others avoided the field entirely, never daring to test whether the rumors were true. Parents, too, were unsettled. Some still drove by the school in the evenings, parking their cars along the curb, staring out at the darkened windows as if waiting for their children to appear. The grief had turned into a ritual, a quiet vigil kept year after year. They never stopped hoping, but the hope had soured into something restless, something that gnawed at them in the dark hours of the night. When the 8th anniversary approached, candles flickered once more at the steps of the school. Families gathered, holding photos, reciting prayers, trying to summon answers from a silence that had lasted far too long. But that year felt different. Some swore the air itself was heavier, the shadows deeper, as though the ground was hiding something ready to break free. In the months that followed, strange incidents increased. Students reported losing things, pens, notebooks, even shoes, only to have them turn up in odd places, as if deliberately moved. A janitor cleaning late one evening swore he heard children laughing in the basement, though the lights were out and the doors locked. He quit the next day, refusing to return. By 2012, the legend of the missing friends had grown into something almost mythic. New students who hadn't been alive during the disappearance still knew the stories by heart. And while the police considered the case long cold, the town itself had never stopped watching, waiting, and wondering. They didn't know that nature itself, with one spark and a wall of flame, was about to rip open the ground and reveal what had been buried beneath their feet for all those years. The summer of 2012 had been hotter than anyone could remember. Weeks without rain had left the grass behind the school brittle and yellow, the weeds bone-dry and sharp to the touch. The abandoned field stretched like a forgotten scar, ignored for years but never truly forgotten. Parents warned their children to stay away, not because of snakes or broken glass, but because of the stories. That field had grown its own legend, whispers of voices, shadows flickering between the reeds, laughter that didn't belong. Most kids avoided it altogether. But nature didn't care about legends. Nature was about to force the field's secrets into the light. On a late August afternoon, smoke began to rise. No one knew exactly how the fire started. Some blamed a careless cigarette, others thought it was the heat itself, the sun baking the field into kindling until a spark caught. Within minutes, flames leapt across the weeds, orange tongues licking the air, black smoke curling upward and blotting out the blue sky. Sirens wailed as fire trucks barreled down the street, their tires skidding as they stopped in front of the school. Students evacuated from summer programs stood across the road, wide-eyed, watching the flames devour the field that had haunted their childhood stories. The fire raged for hours. Water cannons hissed against the heat, smoke billowed into the neighborhood, ash rained down onto parked cars. By dusk, when the last embers were finally beaten into silence, the once wild field was unrecognizable. Gone were the tall weeds and tangled vines. In their place stretched a charred wasteland, black earth scarred and steaming under the night sky. The ground that had hidden its secrets for 8 long years now lay exposed. At first, it seemed like nothing more than destruction. Firefighters packed up their hoses, neighbors murmured about insurance, and police set up a casual perimeter to keep kids from wandering into the unstable ash. But then, a volunteer firefighter noticed something gleaming faintly in the dirt near the center of the field. It was a rusted corner of metal, scorched black, half buried in the soil. He knelt down, brushed away the ash, and realized it was a box, an old, dented container that had somehow survived the flames. When investigators pried it open, the air seemed to still. Inside, there were notebooks, the pages warped from water damage, the edges singed but intact. Drawings spilled across the paper. Strange sketches of doorways, hallways, and spirals that led downward into darkness. Maps of the school grounds were scrawled with arrows and notes. And then the handwriting, messy, urgent, was recognized by one of the parents who had been called to the site. It was her child's handwriting, a child who had vanished in 2004. The notebooks repeated one phrase again and again, written in frantic strokes that carved deep into the paper: "We found the door." Whispers rippled through the crowd that had gathered behind the police tape. Reporters shoved microphones toward officials who had no answers. Parents clutched each other, tears running down their faces. For the first time in 8 years, there was evidence, something tangible, something undeniable. But with the discovery came new questions, darker and more unsettling than the silence that had preceded them. If the children had written these notes, when had they been written? Why had the notebooks been buried? And what did it mean, this door they claimed to have found? The fire, meant to destroy, had instead pulled open the first loose thread of a mystery that had been woven tight around the town for nearly a decade. And as investigators prepared to dig deeper into the scorched soil, no one could have predicted just how much darker the truth beneath the field was going to be. The morning after the fire, the field behind the school no longer looked like a forgotten patch of weeds. It looked like a battlefield. The ground was blackened and uneven, smoke still curling up from cracks in the soil. Police tape fluttered in the breeze, circling the area where the rusted box had been found. Parents stood silently at the edges, their faces pale and hollow, waiting for answers that the town had denied them for 8 long years. Detectives arrived early, accompanied by forensic teams and equipment that seemed too sophisticated for such a small town. They weren't just combing through ashes anymore, they were digging, scanning, searching beneath the earth itself. Ground-penetrating radar was rolled across the scorched soil, its screen flickering with faint outlines below the surface. The images revealed something unnatural, a hollow space hidden beneath layers of dirt. At first, the investigators thought it was just a collapsed drainage pipe or a forgotten root cellar from decades ago. But when shovels struck the soft soil and the ground gave way, the truth began to emerge. A sinkhole yawned open, jagged and dark, its edges crumbling under the weight of curious onlookers. The pit seemed to breathe cold air as if exhaling secrets long kept. Officers leaned in with flashlights, their beams cutting through the shadows to reveal scattered fragments at the bottom. At first glance, it looked like trash left to rot, scraps of fabric, warped metal, broken wood. But as the pieces were lifted one by one, a terrible recognition spread through the gathered crowd. A torn scrap of denim that matched the jeans one of the children had worn on the day they vanished. A plastic hair clip, melted at one edge, but still intact in its childish pastel color. A shoe, small, faded, scuffed, its laces tied neatly as though it had once been worn with care. The families pressed against the barricades, sobbing, shouting, demanding to know what had been found. Officers moved quickly, bundling the items into evidence bags, their expressions grim. But no bones appeared, no remains of the children themselves. It was as if they had been there, and yet had not, like someone had deliberately placed these things in the sinkhole as markers, a cruel reminder without closure. As the excavation continued, more chilling discoveries surfaced. Strange markings were carved into pieces of wood pulled from the pit, symbols that no one could immediately recognize. The edges were blackened, suggesting they had been burned long before the fire that swept the field. On one plank, a phrase had been etched in the same messy handwriting as the notebooks: "Don't follow the voices." The discovery unsettled everyone present. What voices? What door? The questions from the notebooks now echoed louder in everyone's minds. The idea of a simple accident, of the children wandering off and getting lost, no longer fit. Something else had happened, something deliberate, something hidden beneath the ordinary walls of the school and the earth it sat on. That night, the sinkhole was covered and secured, guarded by police under floodlights. But the town didn't sleep. Rumors churned through every household. That the children had found something buried underground, that the school itself was built over tunnels no one wanted to talk about, that the phrase, "we found the door," was not just metaphor but a literal warning. For the first time in years, fear returned to the town with sharp teeth. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was alive again, and it was pulling everyone deeper into a darkness they had tried for nearly a decade to forget. The investigation team, now invigorated by the breakthrough from the burnt field, began piecing together the chain of events that might have led to the disappearance of the students. Detective Hall sat in the dimly lit station room, a map of the town spread out before him. Red strings connected pins marking the school, the old field, the train station, and even a run-down motel on the outskirts. It looked like the chaotic mind of someone desperate to find meaning in a web of lies. 8 years of unanswered questions now seemed to swirl into something coherent. The charred remains of the field had revealed more than just items. They had pointed to a possible route, a place where the students might have been taken, and perhaps even a clue about who was responsible. Parents of the missing students, who had long since given up hope, suddenly began appearing at the station again, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and cautious anticipation. Mrs. Andrews, whose daughter Lily had been among the vanished, gripped Detective Hall's arm and whispered, "Please tell me this means they're still out there." The detective hesitated, because while the evidence was stronger than before, it didn't guarantee survival. Still, he didn't dismiss her hope. He needed the parents' trust as the investigation pressed forward. Meanwhile, whispers started spreading around town. Old rumors resurfaced, stories about a secretive group that had been active in the early 2000s, something tied to the school, cloaked in mystery, and spoken of only in hushed tones. Former teachers who had retired after the scandal returned reluctantly to answer questions. One of them admitted that in the months before the disappearance, strange men had been seen near the school late at night, moving equipment into storage rooms that students were told to avoid. The burned field, once an empty piece of land, had now become a symbol. It was no longer just a fire site, it was a stage where secrets had been forced into the light. And as Detective Hall stared at the charred earth during his return visit, he couldn't shake the sensation that someone, somewhere, had intentionally started that fire. Not to destroy evidence, but to reveal it at the right time. The thought chilled him to his core, for it meant that whoever had orchestrated the student's disappearance might still be watching, guiding the investigation like pieces on a chessboard. The case was no longer just about finding missing children, it was about unraveling a plan that had been set in motion years before. The town of Millstone had always carried an uneasy quiet, but after the discoveries at the burnt field, that silence turned heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Detective Hall found himself poring over old police records, school logs, and even town council minutes, searching for anything that could link the field to the vanished students. That's when something odd caught his eye. In the school's maintenance reports from 2004, there were repeated references to restricted access storage and requests for night security that had never been approved. The signatures at the bottom of those requests didn't match any staff members Hall could find in employment records. It was as though someone had been working within the school under a false identity, preparing the ground for whatever had happened. Hall called in his partner, Officer Ramirez, and together they drove to the old school building, now partially abandoned and used only for storage. The long hallways echoed with their footsteps, and dust hung thick in the air. They stopped outside a locked door in the basement that had been mentioned in the old reports. The hinges were rusted, but the lock was new, far too new for a door that was supposed to have been untouched for years. With a heavy strike of a crowbar, the door gave way, swinging open with a groan that seemed to echo endlessly. Inside, the room was bare except for strange markings on the concrete floor. Circles, symbols, and chalk lines stretched across the space, faded but still visible. It didn't look like ordinary graffiti, it looked deliberate, ritualistic, as though the place had once been used for secret gatherings. Scattered along the walls were fragments of burned paper, blackened to ash except for faint words that could still be read: The Chosen, 8, and Transition. Ramirez froze when he saw the word 8. There had been exactly 8 students who had disappeared in 2004. As they documented the evidence, both men felt the prickling sensation of being watched. The room was too quiet, and even the air seemed colder. Then, beneath a loose floorboard, they found something that made Hall's stomach twist. It was a photograph, old and faded, showing the missing students in their school uniforms, standing together in front of the very basement door they had just broken open. But behind them, almost blending into the shadows, was the faint outline of a tall figure, face obscured, hands resting on the shoulders of 2 of the children. Hall's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a place where the students had been brought, it was a place they had been gathered willingly or unwillingly, perhaps for the beginning of something far darker. The realization gnawed at him as he slid the photo into an evidence bag. If the students had been led here, if they had stood before this very door with that figure in the shadows, then the disappearance hadn't been random. It had been planned meticulously, orchestrated by someone who had the power to hide in plain sight. And as they left the basement, locking it behind them, Hall couldn't shake the thought that the figure in the photograph had never truly left Millstone. The fire in the field, the resurfaced evidence, it all felt like breadcrumbs deliberately left for them to follow. The photograph from the basement weighed heavily on Detective Hall's mind, a silent reminder that the missing students had once stood on that very ground. Back at the station, he spread the evidence across the table: charred fragments from the field, the photograph, the burned notes with cryptic words, and maps of the town. Ramirez leaned over, tracing the word transition with his finger, muttering, "This isn't random." Someone was preparing them for something. The unease in his voice mirrored Hall's own thoughts. As they studied the photograph again, Hall noticed something subtle. Behind the tall figure obscured in the shadows, a faint emblem could be seen on the wall. Zooming in on the enhanced copy, it looked like a crest, a circular mark with intersecting lines, almost like a seal. It didn't belong to the school. In fact, when they cross-referenced it, they found it linked to a long-defunct organization known in local whispers as the Order of Ash. Old newspaper clippings described the group as a clandestine society rumored to hold initiation rites in the early 2000s, though nothing had ever been proven. The discovery sent chills through both men. If this order had taken the children, what had become of them during those lost 8 years? And why had the fire in the field exposed their traces now, after so much time? Hall was struck by a dreadful possibility: perhaps the fire hadn't been an accident at all. Perhaps someone inside the order, or someone connected to it, wanted these clues found. That night, Hall drove back to the field alone. Moonlight bathed the charred ground in silver, and the air smelled faintly of soot. As he walked the perimeter, his flashlight caught something glinting half buried in the dirt, a metallic badge. Pulling it free, he saw the same crest etched into the metal that had been in the photograph. His heart pounded. Someone had been here recently, perhaps during or after the fire, leaving breadcrumbs like an invisible hand guiding him closer. Suddenly, the distant sound of branches cracking made Hall whirl around. His flashlight beam swept across the dark tree line, but nothing moved. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him, unseen but deliberate. The field, the basement, the photo, everything pointed toward the presence of someone still pulling the strings. Hall pocketed the badge and left the field, but not without the crushing certainty that the figure from the photograph was not just part of the past. He was here, now, and he was watching. The town of Millstone was no longer just a place of secrets, it was a stage, and the investigation had become a performance carefully arranged for Hall to follow step by step. The missing children's story was not buried, it was unfolding. And someone wanted him to see every piece of it. Detective Hall barely slept that night. The badge burned in his pocket like a brand, the crest of the Order of Ash staring back at him whenever he closed his eyes. By morning, Ramirez found him already at the station, poring over archives again. The deeper they dug, the more unsettling connections emerged. The Order wasn't just an urban legend. Old police files revealed a string of unexplained disappearances in neighboring towns dating back to the 1980s. Each case was eerily similar. Groups of young people vanishing without a trace, with rumors of strange gatherings near abandoned buildings or secluded fields. None of the victims had ever been found. The realization hit Hall like a wave. What happened to the 8 students in 2004 wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern, one that had spanned decades. And if the fire had truly been set to reveal the past, it meant someone inside the Order might have turned against them, trying to expose what had been hidden for so long. But why now? And why here? Later that day, Hall and Ramirez interviewed a retired janitor who had worked at the school in 2004. At first reluctant, the man finally confessed he had seen something the night before the students disappeared. He had been cleaning the east wing when he noticed lights in the basement where no one was supposed to be. From the crack of the door, he saw the children standing in a circle, pale and silent, as several adults in dark clothing moved around them, chanting in low tones. He swore he heard the words, "Ascension," and "8 chosen." Frightened, he left without reporting it, and the next day the children were gone. His eyes filled with tears as he whispered, "I've lived with that guilt for 8 years." The testimony shook both detectives. It confirmed what the evidence had been hinting at: the missing students had been part of some kind of ritual. And yet, the question gnawed at Hall: what had been the purpose of this transition, or ascension? That evening, Hall returned home only to find an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single piece of paper, handwritten in jagged script, "You're following well. Don't stop. The truth comes at the 10th step." His blood ran cold. Someone was not only watching the investigation but guiding it. The fire, the photograph, the badge, the janitor's confession, each was a breadcrumb, and now even the detectives' movements were being manipulated. As Hall held the note under the dim light of his kitchen, he realized with a sinking dread that he was no longer just investigating a case. He was inside a game designed by the very people he was chasing. And if the note was right, the truth wasn't far. But truth in Millstone had already proven dangerous. The words from the note echoed in Detective Hall's mind all night: the truth comes at the 10th step. He didn't know if it was a threat, a warning, or an invitation, but he understood one thing: whoever had written it wanted him to continue. By morning, Hall and Ramirez returned to the evidence wall, staring at the tangled strings that connected the field, the basement, the Order of Ash, and the missing students. It was all pointing somewhere, and the detectives knew the 10th step wasn't just a metaphor. It was literal. They retraced the case from the beginning, counting each breakthrough like stepping stones: the fire, the items in the field, the charred notes, the parents' renewed hope, the basement door, the photograph, the crest, the badge, the janitor's confession, and finally, the note itself. 10. The realization settled like a heavy stone in Hall's chest. The 10th step had been reached. That meant the truth was close, but perhaps it had already begun revealing itself. That night, another fire broke out, this time in the abandoned motel on the edge of town, the same location Hall had marked on his map weeks earlier. When they arrived, the flames had already died down, leaving a skeleton of blackened beams and scorched walls. But amidst the ashes, something remained untouched, almost as if spared deliberately: a row of 8 wooden chairs, perfectly aligned in a circle, each with chains fastened to the armrests. The sight hollowed out the detectives' stomachs. On one of the chairs rested a single school shoe, its leather cracked with age, but still bearing the initials, L.A., Lily Andrews. Ramirez cursed under his breath, while Hall fought to keep his hands steady. The missing students had been here, bound, waiting for whatever ritual the Order had orchestrated. And then, in the soot-stained corner of the room, Hall saw it, a mural scorched into the wall but still legible. 8 children painted in black, with a towering figure above them, faceless and crowned in ash. Beneath it, the words, The circle is unbroken. The chosen do not vanish, they ascend. Hall staggered back, his mind reeling. The implication was terrifying. The children hadn't simply disappeared, they had been taken for something the Order truly believed was transcendence. Whether they were alive somewhere, transformed, or forever lost, no one could say. But the Order believed they had succeeded. As Hall and Ramirez stood in silence, the crackle of burning embers the only sound, a cold wind swept through the ruin. And then, faintly, almost too faint to be real, came the sound of children's laughter. High, distant, and echoing through the ruins. Ramirez's flashlight shook in his hands as he muttered, "Tell me you heard that." Hall said nothing. His throat had gone dry, his heart frozen in his chest. The case had begun with a disappearance. It had led them through fire, secrets, and whispers of a cult that spanned decades. But now, at the 10th step, they stood at the edge of a truth darker than either had prepared for. The children had not vanished into nothing. They had been taken into something that still lingered. And as the night pressed down on Millstone, Hall realized the game wasn't over. It had only just begun.